Okay, so welcome back to our Journey Beyond Yourself Summit. I am very excited that we have with us Alex Hutchinson, author and journalist, and much more. I know, having read your book, that you, Alex, are a National Magazine award-winning journalist. I know that you write mainly about science and endurance sports these days. You have contributed to many amazing publications such as Outside and The Globe and the Mail. You're a senior editor at Canadian Running. You were previously a Runner's World columnist, contributing editor at Popular Mechanics. And I know that your work has appeared elsewhere, such as New York Times. And you have your latest book out is called Endure, Mind, Body, and Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance, which is a fantastic book. And I also know from that book that you are also an Olympic, you got an Olympic time to be in the Olympics with your own running. So you're an athlete yourself.
I'll jump in just before the gods punish me and say I did not qualify for the Olympics. I competed at the Olympic trials as a middle distance runner, but I am not an Olympic runner, and I would not claim that mantle unjustifiably.
Oh, you're humble as well. You're humble as well. Well, your book, Alex, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and my interest was because obviously this summit is all about using our brain and body to go beyond where we thought we stopped. And you, of course, have studied this in terms of the body and athletes and pushing ourselves. And the message, there's so much in your book, but a big message that I got out of it was really that you came full kind of circle after scientific scrutiny beyond belief and getting all the stats and really, breaking down what the body's capable of. And it was a bit like, for me, the bumblebee, where at the end you kind of said, there's just more going on. The brain is a huge component. So I want to discuss that with you today. But first, I want to ask you a question, because in your book, it's a huge book and it's brilliantly written. I was saying to you this before we started recording, brilliantly written. Alex is a fantastic writer and it's very engaging. And the research in that book is phenomenal. And as a non-athlete, I learned so much. It doesn't just cover running. You cover all athleticism, all sports, and really people pushing themselves to the limit, whether it's parachuting, free diving, running, of course, all sorts of things. There's just so much in it, and there's so many anecdotes. Some are quite gruesome, where you describe the end points of people's limits. And there's so many anecdotes that I love. But I wanted to ask you, what are maybe your top 3 anecdotes from the research of the book that just blew your mind, of people's pushing themselves either to the point of no return or to the point of just return?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that was a lot of the fun for me. Was I spent about 10 years working on the book, and a lot of that was trying to understand the science of human limits. What is it that limits us? Like you said, the limits that feel physical are often in the brain, but a big part of that was also looking for these stories, trying to understand, because I didn't want to just write a whole pile of, here's 118 scientific studies I read, and now I'm going to vomit them on you. I wanted to try and understand how this science actually applies in real life. And so the stories were really fascinating to me. The area that was probably the most interesting and surprising to me was free diving, because I come from, like you said, I come from a running background. I'd been writing as a journalist about the science of endurance sports. So I knew a lot about that area, but I knew nothing about free diving. I knew nothing about the fact that a human being can hold his or her breath for as much as 11 minutes and 35 seconds. That's the world record for just plain old breath holding, no tricks, no inhaling oxygen, nothing. 11 minutes and 35 seconds. And so there's this group of people, competitive free divers, who will dive more than 100 meters below the surface of the sea, a guy named William Trubridge from New Zealand, had set the then record of, I think it's 103 meters with nothing but, some fins on his feet, some flippers. And so understanding, first of all, how is that possible? And then how they approach that task. Because it's not just, when you're freediving, it's not just holding your breath. It's one thing to hold your breath, because then when you reach your limits, you exhale. If you're freediving, halfway through that when you judge that you're halfway through your limits, then you have to turn around and make it all the way back to the surface before you black out. And so to me, that reading about freedivers and this guy, William Trubridge, who set the world record, after having had some blackouts underwater where he lost his sense of his taste, I think, it really cuts to the chase of like, it's one thing to run a race. I've run a lot of races where I feel like I'm at my limits, but there's never the sense of, if I misjudged halfway, I'm going to die. So that was really fascinating to me. And also understanding the physiology of, there's all these things that happen when you when you dive underwater, or when you try and hold your breath. Like you have a response. If you just, the thing about where you splash water on your face, if you're trying to sort of sober yourself up, well, that's part of the mammalian diving reflex, which is this thing that we share with all mammals. Cool water on your face tells you that you're submerging your face in water. Your heart rate immediately lowers, and the places that you're sending blood change, because you want to get all the blood to your brain to keep yourself conscious. So that is a way of calming yourself down, because you're tricking yourself into thinking you're submerging, you're going to have to hold your breath. And then there's other things that happen. Your spleen will squeeze itself like a sponge after a few minutes of breath holding, because it has a bunch of red blood cells with oxygen in it. And so it recognizes, okay, now's the time to release this reserve, and it'll squeeze itself and let more red blood cells into your circulation. This is why Sherpas have larger spleens than other people in Nepal, because when they go to high altitudes, they need to have an extra reserve of oxygen. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here, but the freediving thing blew my mind, because it was something I knew nothing about. And believe me, I have never been, more than 3 feet below the surface of the ocean.
Yeah. Yes. No, you're not babbling. It's fascinating. And I mean, that also blew my mind. But I think the thing that is fascinating to me is the motivating factors. And perhaps we can get into this as to why you would do that. Because, I know that, and you wrote about this in the book, the kind of history of freediving, where there's populations who free dive and their children are learned the technique to find food. And that makes sense to me. Just pushing yourself to the point of blacking out a few times. I think this anecdote in your book was the one that his mother was watching, wasn't she, on the screen at home? As a mother myself, I was thinking, of all the sports, I hope my children don't choose freediving, because as you say, it's very easy to die or have brain damage. And this guy had already sustained damage that it hadn't reversed anyway. Had it by the time he went again, the loss of taste or it's amazing. So and this is a theme through the book as well, whether we're talking about the great adventurists, and the people who just went out into the most barren places, the great explorers, the most barren places, and just pushed themselves where humans don't live for a reason. What do you think? Let's talk about those motivating factors. What did you conclude by looking at all of these crazy people, extreme people who push themselves to the limits? You mentioned a few in the book.
So this is a great question, and it's an interesting question, because let me say this: I've done a lot of interviews about the book. Most of them are from people that, a lot of runners have blogs. I've done a lot of endurance sports interviews from people who are in this world of pushing themselves for no apparent reason, and nobody asks the why question.
Right.
But I think the why question is a really fascinating one, and not to sort of spill the beans, but I'm putting together a proposal for my next book, and essentially it, not in so many words, but what I want to tackle in my next book is the why. If the endure is how do you push yourself, then the next question is why do you push yourself? And it's not just a question of why do you push yourself as a freediver, or why do you try to climb Mount Everest? I don't want to make it sound like I'm having a midlife crisis, but you also think about this in the context of career development and just life progression. I'm reaching a point where it's like, how much do I want to keep pushing myself, keep flogging myself, versus try to start saying, hey, I like where I'm at right now. I want to enjoy my life, as opposed to keep pushing, because there is this drive. And I think it's not a stretch or an analogy, just a stretch. It's not stretching the analogy to say that in some ways, the thing that compels people to keep striving to climb the corporate ladder, for example, is similar to the things that compels some other people to go to Antarctica and try and cross-country ski across Antarctica like Henry Worsley did, which is one of the again, one of the quite, well, let's say a sad ending in one of the anecdotes in my book. Why do we do that? I don't have a two-sentence answer. I don't have a two-sentence answer. I think there's something to be said for, there's a concept in mythology, in the study of mythology, called the hero's journey, which is a guy named Joseph Campbell in the mid 20th century did comparative mythology, looked at myths around the world, and found that they're all different, but they all follow a similar structure of heading out into the unknown, confronting uncertainty, maybe even facing a sort of descent into the abyss, and then triumphing and coming back. And I think that sort of archetypal narrative is really deeply embedded within us, that we want to be challenged in a way that uses our capabilities to their fullest. And you can relate this to the concept of flow, which people talk about a lot these days, where one of the preconditions for getting into a flow state is that you're challenged at a level that is difficult for you, but within your grasp. So it's something you think you can do, it's just beyond your current grasp. And there's something incredibly satisfying about meeting one of those goals, but it's not just about meeting the goal. There's something really energizing about being in pursuit of one of those goals that is hard, but you think you can do it. And one other comparison that I'll make is just because it's a book I just read in the last couple of weeks. There's a book called Why We Run by a biologist named Bernd Heinrich about 20 years ago. And he tries to explore the evolutionary reasons. And to him, all throughout life, what we're engaged on is what he calls substitute chases, that we evolved to be thinking long range and, chasing the antelope across the savannah. And we don't do that anymore, but in various other aspects of our life, we're looking for things that engage us, that aren't over in 10 seconds, but that don't take 10 years, but that we can pursue and have the feeling that there's a worthy reward at the end of it. So anyway, the short answer is I don't know why we do it, but I think it's really deeply wired, and that even people who don't explore the Antarctic are expressing that urge in different ways in different aspects of their lives.
Yes, I agree. And I am looking forward to your next book already then, because, looking at, we all have the drive, but it's like where our limits stop. So I completely agree with you. This summit's all about expanding beyond where we are so that we can get to the next level. And I think it's always good to not get stuck in our comfortable and to push ourselves to the next uncomfortable. But there is a line that's like where uncomfortable ends and life, immediate danger starts. And it seems to be, I'm sure you'll find this. I'm putting high expectations on. Find this in your next book, to keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. And I mean, in the book, you have examples of people who may have pushed themselves and turned around, but then they go again. They keep pushing. And another thing that comes to mind is when you were talking about not having a midlife crisis, I was thinking the thing that came to me, again, as a mother, is I know you have young children. So definitely, I think when you have young children, your life stops being completely about yourself and your limits expand into their lives. And I think that's an aspect But I wonder what the difference is with male and female, and I'm sure there's a crossover there too. And another thing that comes to mind is we have a friend, a good friend who is a professional wingsuiter, and when doing wingsuiting, he's often at funerals of friends. It's a thing that happens. I remembered as well in your book, you said something that blew my mind. That was, I can't remember the figure, but how many people die from free diving per year?
Free diving, yeah, I can't remember. It's like 75 some years or something like that.
Much higher than is sensible. So, and his world is this too, and it's very dangerous. And of course, his wife, whenever she says goodbye, honey, have a good day at work, it's kind of like, come back. But when they had a baby, she went from being completely understanding and you go, honey, to thinking, shouldn't we maybe talk about different career paths, because now it's not just about you, it's about your child. Whereas he didn't have that mental shift. And that fascinates me. It's like, there's got to be some differences. What those drivers, yes, which it sounds like you're going to get into for your next book.
Yeah, and I can pretty much guarantee that I won't have all the answers, even if I spend 10 years on it. It's it's one of the great sort of human problems, right? But it's I think the question of that, like you were talking about before, is how do you know how to push through false limits without pushing too hard? I think one of the big what I took away from the research I did for this book, for Endure, is that it is possible to push yourself to death. I mean, and it's, of course, if you're doing it in Antarctica or something, you may not be particularly tired, but if you break your ankle in the middle of Antarctica, you're going to die just because of the circumstances, or you might at least. For the most part, though, just in broad terms, the limits we encounter, the physical limits we encounter that feel very non-negotiable, are usually pretty far from the limits of actual danger. So let me give an example from breath holding again. I had a chance to chat with a guy named Brandon Hendrickson, who set the American record for breath holding, which was a mere 8 minutes and 35 seconds. So still pretty amazing. But and there's something that happens when you hold your breath that if you ignore the signals from your body, eventually your breathing muscles, your diaphragm just starts contracting involuntarily, because it's concluded that you're out to lunch and it needs to force you to breathe. And if you're a trained breath holder, you can just ignore that. You can keep your mouth closed even though you're convulsing. And I would mark that as the point of, like, that is where your brain thinks the real limit is. That is where you really should stop.
Yes.
So for Brandon Hendrickson, that starts about 4 minutes. And then he keeps holding his breath for another 4 minutes before he gets to the point where, and even at that point, he doesn't just pass out. At 8 minutes, 35 seconds in his record holding breath, his coach taps him on the shoulder and says, I think that's about enough. If you keep holding, we risk, we don't know. You've already disabled all the alarm systems. You've gone past what your brain thinks the limits are.
Yes.
That's a huge difference. 4 minutes, the brain is like, you're done. 8 minutes, you're like, okay, now I'm going to stop. So, and you can't make a direct analogy between holding your breath and, running a marathon. It's not like, oh, I ran a marathon in 3 hours. If I really wanted to, I could run it in an hour and a half. It's not, that's not a direct comparison. But I think in most circumstances, if you ignore the signals that you need to slow down or stop or whatever, physically speaking, you're not going to kill yourself. It's except in very unusual conditions like extreme heat, where your brain doesn't calculate very well. When you start to expand that to more sort of conceptual, the idea of pushing and in life, then it's a little more complicated, because we're not talking about like dropping dead. We're talking about, balancing priorities in life, like as you were talking about, kids versus career versus, other things that you may want in your life. And so I think that the same first principle applies, which is that in general, when you bump up against the limit and say, this is all I can do, that's not usually true, right? Like you're usually limiting yourself prematurely. But then it takes a lot of careful thought to think, well, what am I sacrificing if I keep pushing, or what are the downsides? And I think that's something that just requires a lot of reflection.
Yeah. So as you were talking there, I was thinking this is probably a terrible analogy, but sometimes I may have been noted for, in my car, when the light goes on for the petrol gauge, I may say, I know I've got another 20 kilometers. It's fine. Whereas somebody else can get in that job and go, okay, the lights just come on. We have to find somewhere now. And it's because we have, and if it's a different car, I kind of have a tendency to have pushed it a little bit so that then what your limit is, what your backup reserve is, right? And it's a kind of the analogy I was thinking about when you were warning signs. We have our lights go off, and then we can push ourselves beyond that. And it's individual, perhaps, to learn how much reserve you've got in the tank until it's game over, until you cannot go anymore. And that's just got to be pushing and pushing and pushing to experiment, right? So at some part, if you just experiment too much, you don't get a chance to come back if you're in an extreme environment, or, but if it's just pushing yourself generally. So that was the analogy that came to mind. And I guess I want to ask you, for the average person who is not an athlete, and for the person watching this summit, when we're talking about being able to go to that next level, which we've agreed there always is. So when we think, I'm too tired to, I can't be bothered to, I don't know how to, I don't think I could, all of these limiting factors, with all the research that you've done, what do you think are some factors or tools or principles that would help us just generally to come back, whether it's self-talk or, actual tools or principles to help us to get to that next level, sort of in a more, relevant for most people who aren't just athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you just alluded to this, but I think really the sort of step zero is becoming aware of the stories you tell yourself, the monologue in your head, because in a real sense, that story becomes reality. If it's a cliche, but if you tell yourself you can't do it, then you're right. And that doesn't mean necessarily that if you tell yourself you can do it, you'll be right. That's a trickier question, but you definitely will be right if you tell yourself you can't do it. And there's to take the analogy again from sports, there's still a lot unknown about the nature of physical limits, but a sort of general principle in the theories that scientists currently hold: the master switch to your limits is your perception of effort. It's not if you're trying to, whether you're trying to lift a heavy weight or run a marathon or whatever. It's not the ultimate decider of whether you can do this is not how much lactic acid is in your muscles or what's your heart rate or anything. It's how hard does it feel. If it feels, and you can put that on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10. And if you get to the point where you're like, this feels like 9 out of 10, I don't think I can keep going, then you stop. And the thing is that perception, that perception of effort, of course, depends on objective reality and physiology. How fast are you running? How fast your heart is beating? But it also depends on how you're interpreting those signals. So if you're telling yourself, this is really hard, I don't think I can do this, then you're going to rate a given level of effort as harder, and you're going to quit earlier. And so I think this is an absolutely general sort of principle that if you're your own worst critic and you're constantly telling yourself you can't do it, that becomes self-fulfilling. And it's possible, it's not necessarily easy, but it's possible to first of all, to become aware of what you're telling yourself, to challenge some of those statements. Am I incapable of doing that? And then to work on alternatives, other things you can say. There's actually I just came across a book, which I have not yet read, but the book is called Chatter by Ethan Cross, published a couple months ago, about taking on the negative monologue in your mind. So I haven't read it yet, so I can't endorse it wholeheartedly, but I heard from a friend that it's good. And this is the kind of tool that I think, from looking at the sports world, this is the kind of tool that I think should apply in the general world, all of the world.
Yeah. I also have it on my reading list. So
good work. We're on the same wavelength.
We are. So you've reminded me, one of the things I loved about your book is because I'm a big fan of maintaining possibility, right? I have this kind of thing that, you know, as children, we're this brand new blank canvas where anything is possible, really. Who knows what the limitations on that child are? And as we grow, we just kind of get, well, you can't really, well, no, you won't be able to, well, you can't, no, you're not suited to that, or you don't have the mechanics for that, or you're, you know, and we our area of possibility diminishes. And I'm a big fan in anything that encourages our perception of possibility to remain open. And specifically with children, you know, if I could, I would do a huge experiment where we just bring up some children in only yes you can possibility and see where that takes them, because of course that would affect that self-talk that we're talking about, that we put on ourselves or we take on and accept in ourselves, whether it's come from other people. So one of the things I love about your book is that dotted throughout what I saw was this possibility. So whether we're talking about the guy who lifts the car to rescue the guy underneath, and we've all heard those stories, or the people that push themselves where you're just beyond what we think is possible. To me, if one person can do it, it's possible. And I think those are the messages we need to hear more. So I absolutely loved that about your book. Apart from, you know, the car sticks with me, but what other kind of examples can you give us that you came across, or that you come across with your work, about where it helps us to maintain that? If someone else can do it, it's possible. So that self-talk of I can't, it's not possible, isn't true. That narrative isn't the truth.
Yeah. You know, I think maybe the best illustration of that is the phenomenon of Kenyan runners, which, you know, has been you know, they're amazing. They've dominated the world of running for 40 years or more. Most of the runners come from a very small area in Kenya. It's not just like every Kenyan's a runner. There's like one small region in the Rift Valley where all these runners, it's like something like 60 of the fastest 100 marathons in history have been run by Kenyan runners, most of whom are from a, you know, an area the size of, I don't know, Greater Sydney or something. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how big it is, but from a relatively small part of the country. And there's endless debate on, you know, is it genetic? Is it, you know, motivational that it's the, you know, it's their path out of poverty? Is it something to do with being at altitude? And undoubtedly, a lot of these things are true or contribute. But you can find any number of populations of people who are living at high altitude, whose ancestors have been at high altitude for generations, and who are living in poverty and would really benefit from making money as runners. But there's one small region of Kenya where it's a reality. And there's something special about that region, which is that you basically cannot walk down the street and meet somebody who does not have a cousin or a friend or a schoolmate or a parent or a sibling who is a professional runner who, you know, made enough money to buy a farm and some livestock, and is now one of the, you know, a king among men there, because they have, you know, in a place where the average annual income is $500. If you come home with $5,000, you're doing well. And so everyone there is like, you know, of course I can do this. And I met a guy I reported on when I was living in Ottawa. I was working for a newspaper. This is about 15 years ago. And I wrote a profile of the guy who won the Ottawa Marathon. And he was a guy from Kenya. And I wanted to find out about his life and what had got him running. And I was like, how did you start running? And he said, well, you know, it wasn't like a 15-year-old schoolboy or anything. He was 19 or 20. He had been out of school for years. He was working as a manual laborer, hauling logs through the forest. And in the 1996 Olympic Games, he was listening to them on the radio. And he heard that a guy named Eric Wainana had won, I can't remember if it was a silver or a bronze medal. I think it was a bronze medal. And he's like, Eric Wainana? I used to beat that guy in school. Right. I should be a runner. If he could go win the Olympic medal, I should be a runner. This guy hadn't run since, you know, in 10 years. He had no background. So he thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it.
Brilliant.
He quit his job hauling logs He went and joined one of the training camps that are common there. He had no money. He was married. He had kids. He sent his wife and kids to live with his parents in a grass hut. He spent 3 years training with he didn't know anything. He had never shown that he could be a great runner. He was so poor, he said he didn't even have money to buy a bar of soap. And finally, after 3 years, he looked fit enough that an agent said, hey, I'll fly you over to Canada and see if you can win some races. He went over there, bam, the first year came back with $500, bought the first cow for milking in his family ever. And the next year came back with a few $1,000s, bought a farm, built a house, and on from there. But what struck me is that it's not like this guy was a prodigy from a kid. He's like, this guy's born to be a runner. He's 19 years old or 20 years old. He hears on the radio that some guy won the Olympics. Like, I used to beat that guy in school. I'm going to be a runner. Yeah. And sure enough, he became one. And how many people are there out there who have incredible talents, but who've never taken that plunge and spent 3 years working really hard to see if they can make that dream come true?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that story too. So there's messages here about, number one, our perceptions, noticing our self-limits, our self-talk, our own perception of limits that we put on ourselves. First of all, being aware of them, and then we can do something about them. But number two, there is a strong message here about immersion and what is the norm within your environment. So if in that small area of Kenya, everybody is just a world top runner, then it's not so removed from your norm. That becomes your norm. Well, why wouldn't I do that when Uncle Bob and Cousin Jeff did it, you know? And so I think that's a really strong message that can be incorporated by everybody as well. It's like, what messages are we putting in? You don't have to suddenly go out and change up your friendship group, but we could be immersing ourselves with information and books and podcasts and interviews and summits and about people who are doing these things, so that it seeps into your norm. So if there's something perhaps that you think you can't go beyond, seek out people who've gone beyond and let it seep into you so that you accept it.
Yeah. And often you end up discovering that the people who are doing those amazing things, they were exactly where you were 5 years ago or 3 years ago, that they weren't born with wings or anything like that, that they made a choice and it turned out they could do it. And then maybe they failed at a few other things first. Like it's not that everyone can do everything, but it's that, I think we can all benefit from that attitude that, hey, maybe I can, and I won't know unless I try.
Yes. And I think that's a good point as well. Many people who've succeeded didn't succeed on the first time. Still your guy there who just accepted I could do this. It took him 3 years to get noticed. So still you've got to have that perseverance. You've got to have that ability to fail possibly too. I know that's the norm in the athletic world, isn't it too? Like you're not an instant world-class athlete. You go through the ranks and you fail and you get back up literally and you go again. You get back up and you go again. And there must be a lesson in there somewhere about taking those knockbacks, to get to world class. You must get told, and I know coaching, I'm sure the breadth and not everybody's like this, but I do know that can be harsh and they want the best for you, so they push you to the max. And so you've got to have kind of a thickish skin to stay and not say, this isn't for me, I'm out. What are your thoughts on that? Maintaining the perseverance and determination, but also having to have a bit of a filter against maybe this isn't for me.
I mean, there's a famous, I'll show my age again by saying I was a big Seinfeld fan, and he had an episode on the New York Marathon. He's like, what, New York Marathon? What's that? It's like a guy from Kenya and 50,000 losers. Because it's like, okay, a race like that, there's one winner and everyone else lost. Or if you think, a tennis tournament, there's only one person who ends up winning the tournament. Everyone else ends their tournament with a loss. Yeah. And so, one of the things you have to understand is that setbacks aren't just like necessarily a temporary thing, that dealing with adversity even if you're the second best tennis player in the world, you're going to finish every tournament by losing, to the guy who's the best tournament. And so it doesn't mean you accept the loss or at least it doesn't mean you sort of view it as a victory to lose. Of course you want to win, but you also have to understand that even for the most successful people, life is not just a, endless succession of triumphs. And it's you don't necessarily say I like losing, but I would think if I came second in the Australian Open, I would be able to say that was awesome. I enjoyed that, and I had a great battle, and I got the best out of myself in that final, even though I lost. And so this is another sort of common theme about process versus outcome, right? So you're not necessarily focusing on the fact whether you won or lost, whether you dealt with whether that's the negative. It's like, how did I play? What did I get at? Did I play better than I have ever played before? Did I execute my plan? And sometimes you execute your plan and it doesn't come out the way you wanted. But if you executed your plan, you can be happy with yourself and you can be satisfied. And I say this, you at the very beginning of this podcast, you kindly described me as an Olympic caliber runner. And I said, no, I'm not, because I didn't make the Olympics. But, I spent a good 10 years of my life where making the Olympics was the most important thing in my life. And I made a lot of sacrifices. And I have zero regrets about the 10 years I spent like that. It was, in a sense, in many ways, some of the best years of my life. I didn't make the Olympics, but I had a lot of fun going for it and doing everything I could in the right way. And in the end, there's a lot of luck and a lot of other factors that go into whether you make it or not. But I'm extremely proud of the way I went after it. And I everything I've done since then, I hope to live up to the standard of commitment and pursuit of excellence that I showed there, even though I didn't achieve my goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And whilst you're talking about yourself there, would you mind sharing, because it's kind of looping back, but it's such an important point, on your story when you had your breakthrough? You had your limit. I love about you. I didn't know there was so many stats and science that you do as athletes, but you were like, well, I've calculated this and this and this and this and this, so that's my limit. And then one day something happened and you went beyond that. And there's a similar story with another runner in your book. And we spoke about where he was in his hotel room before the big race. And then he just decided, and he blew his plan out of the window and just decided, why don't I just go all out from word dot and see what happens? And he was with that, elite group. And so there's two similar stories where you have your limit because you've been ingrained in what you could do because of facts and evidence and statistics and measurements. And then something happens and your brain takes a quantum leap of faith. And because of that, you get the results beyond what you could have got.
Yeah. So my story is I was stuck at the 4-minute barrier for 1,500 meters as a teenager and university runner. And for 4 years, I'd been running 401 or 402. And after 4 years, you start to think, I think I've discovered my physical limits. I think there's a brick wall here and maybe I'll run 359, but that's about it. And what ended up, the race where I finally broke through was a very meaningless race, small race, no competition. I was way out in front, but the timekeeper, well, I'll cut to the chase and say, I'll give the short version of the story, which is that the timekeeper gave me the wrong splits. I every 200 meters, it was an indoor race. Every 200 meters, the timekeeper would call out how fast you were going. And the times he called out were faster than I thought I could go. And so I had, moments of panic thinking, oh, I'm going out too fast. But then the realization of, well, but hang on, I feel really good. I feel totally relaxed. And as lap after lap passed, I gained confidence. And I was like, I'm having an amazing day. This is my breakthrough. I've gone through 3 laps. I'm way ahead of my goal pace and I feel fine. And so I stopped listening to the splits and just went for it to try and avoid, wasting this opportunity. And it turned out he'd been giving the wrong splits and I'd actually been sort of right on pace. But because he'd given me that jolt and sort of shattered the connection between how fast I thought I could run and how I thought that should feel, I just went out and ran as hard as I could. And I ended up running 352, which was a 9-second personal best all in one day. And then once I'd done that, my next race, I improved again. And my next race, I improved again. And that was the first time I qualified for the Olympic trials. I improved 17 seconds in 3 races. So that race was in 1996, just to date myself. And I think you can date the book back to that race. I think that race sort of destroyed my ability to believe that every race was just a reflection of my body's ability. I realized the mind has to play a role, and that sort of planted that seed of curiosity that blossomed a few decades later.
Yeah, amazing. Yes, well, I am very pleased that you wrote the book and did all the research for us, because it is fascinating. I'm glad that seed was planted. So, Alex, for our summit, I'm going to end on this question. For people out there wanting to step up and go beyond, you've given us lots of information, and you've possibly already given me your top tip, but I'm going to ask you, what would be your top tip that people can take on and incorporate into their lives that will help them get to the next level?
The top tip. So
a practical
tip. I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I'll say the number one thing is really just to understand that voice in your head, it does not speak the truth. To recognize that, and to refuse to just accept that truth as gospel. But since we've covered that, I'll also say that the one thing I think people really misjudge when they're setting goals for themselves and trying to break through the next level is this is also a cliche, but I think it's a cliche for a reason, is that people overestimate what they can achieve in the short term, but underestimate what they can achieve in the long term. And so people set ambitious goals for themselves, very quickly fall short of the trajectory that they think they need for that goal, and conclude that they couldn't do what they thought they could do. Whereas if they'd set the same goal, but said I can do it in 12 months instead of in 3 months, they would find that they would actually exceed that goal in 12 months. This is certainly true in the running world, where people are like, I want to run a half marathon in 3 months. It's like, no, you're not going to be ready, but you could be running a marathon in a year if you wanted. And so it's important to have short-term goals, but I think it's also important to have a long-term goal, and to be really, really sort of patient in pursuing that, and to understand that every incremental step you take towards that goal is getting there, is getting you in that direction. And you'd be surprised how those incremental moves will add up over the long term. Yes,
I think that's absolute gold, brilliant wisdom. And I think that is a good place for us to pull up. So thank you, Alex. If, of course, you need more inspiration, if your lid is just jammed tight and you want to go beyond, get Alex's book, because it's full of people who have overcome their lids and risen above. And it's also just a brilliant, interesting, well thought out. I learned so much about history as well as athletics, and it's just a really good read, a really good book, beautifully written. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you all the very best, and please let me know when your new book is available, because I am expecting all the answers to all of the world's problems in your next book, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I promise I will fulfill that. And thank you so much for having me in the summit, Sally. It's been really fun to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Alex. All the very best.